Okay, folks, again, my name is Ross Evans. I am with Navionics, and this is the webinar for Mike Delvisco. He is going to go over transitioning from spawn to the post-spawn to the early summer, just that, you know, some would call it a horrible transition, Mike. You're going to be in charge of trying to get these fine folks to understand that it's not as bad as they might think. But when you are ready, sir, we will share your screen.
Okay, I believe I'm full screen here right now.
You are full screen on your deal. I need you to share your screen. Because right now I've got your face full size, and that's great, but the fine people want to see your PowerPoint.
Okay, I just lost my, there we go there. So, how do I share my screen?
It should be right on the top or the bottom of your screen, Mike. It should just say share screen, and you should be able to click on it and then share your PowerPoint. Okay, while Mike's setting that up, folks, I'm going to go over real quick, just so you understand on the top, depending upon your device or perhaps the bottom of your device, you're going to have the opportunity to ask questions. You're going to be able to also do different things where you just you have question and answer, and then you have a chat area. Now, I leave the chat to you guys. You guys can chat about anything while Mike's talking. If you have a question, just type it into the question and answer period. What we're going to do is have Mike kind of go through this presentation, and then at the end, we're going to answer as many questions as we can. So by all means, I encourage you to ask as many questions as you can. This is a great opportunity for you guys to be with these pros. We appreciate their time so much. Mike, thank you very much for joining us tonight. It's a great opportunity for the public just to ask questions from the privacy of their homes. So with that, Mike, I'm going to shut my video off. I'm going to mute myself. They're here to see you, and you are in charge.
Okay, thanks, Ross. And you got my screen full screen now? We're good?
We are full screen. It appears ready to go, and if there's any problems, somebody send us a message, but otherwise it looks fantastic. Thanks, Mike, and it's all yours.
Appreciate it. Everybody doing good tonight? I hope so. Hope everybody's catching some fish this year so far. You know, I don't know where this year's gone. I travel around quite a bit, running all over the country doing seminars in the wintertime, and then, you know, fishing quite a bit too. And we're starting to really kick things in here, fishing wise for me. I've been on the water for about the last month straight and getting ready to be on for about another 6 weeks. I leave again tomorrow, but it's, you know, it's been a pretty good year so far fishing. If you remember, you know, think back, you know, last year and the year before, how unstable things were in the springtime. And that affects a lot of things that go on with the spawn and with the post spawn and things like that, you know. And if you think about summertime patterns are, you know, fairly straightforward. Fall patterns, pretty straightforward. Winter patterns, pretty straightforward. You start to get into pre-spawn, spawn, post-spawn, those three things, and you're dealing with kind of a complex series of issues that can be real good or can be really tough to figure out depending upon what's going on geographically, weather-wise, different lakes. All these sorts of things play into what happens during pre-spawn, spawn, post-spawn. Now, you know, I've had the fortunate deal of being able to live both up in the Northeast and down south where I currently live, and so I'm very well aware of what happens around the country. You know, the spawn up in the Northeast is a little bit different than it is down here in the South, and I've, you know, got to witness both of these things. And post spawn's a little bit different, and summertime's a little bit different. So, you know, I'm going to kind of hopefully put all these pieces together for you guys by the time I'm done and get you pointed in the right direction. But, you know, things have been fairly stable here down south, and I've been watching the the weather up north too, because I'm getting ready to head in another week, head up to Maine for a few weeks. So I've been kind of watching it too. And if you remember last year up in the Northeast, they had a really, really mild winter. Ice out was really early. They had barely any ice, and that affects, you know, that pre-spawn into the spawn. It ramps things up and, you know, moves things along a lot quicker than you know, it would have been if you have a late ice out like they did, you know, this past year. I think ice out was like the third week of April sometime. So that's about on the norm. Things start to get warmed up, and then, you know, we get on to right about now, we're still in the pre-spawn phase in a lot of your Northeast lakes. A lot of the northern climates are still dealing with pre-spawn into spawn, whereas down south where I live, you know, the majority of our spawn is already done, but that's not to say that they're all done. I am pretty convinced. Last week I was practicing for a tournament that I've got coming up, and I'm pretty convinced I caught some pre-spawn fish that are still moving up. So, you know, there's a lot of things that all go into play with trying to put all these pieces together. And we're going to look at hopefully most of that by the time I'm done. So, but things are warming up. You know, it's getting nicer out. The days are getting longer. The fish are starting to move up shallow, if they haven't moved up shallow for you guys, you know, depending upon where you live. And, you know, it's going to start to get really good. So geographically, these things very significantly, you know, like I was saying, what's happening up in the Northeast and, you know, way up north, it is quite a bit in back of what's already happened here down south. And, you know, you guys are probably going to have another, you know, 6 weeks of, you know, this spawn into post-spawn phase, you know, well into probably, you know, the end of June, maybe even the beginning of July. But regardless of where you live and what you do, you know, that spawning usually begins, if you're a smallmouth, somewhere around 55, 57 degrees is kind of that optimum temperature zone, and then, you know, 60, 62 for largemouth, and that's what kind of spurs it. But the thing to kind of pay attention to is that just because the water gets to this initial temperature doesn't mean that every single fish in the lake is going to come up and spawn. This thing happens, the whole spawning phase happens in a sequence, and it can get derailed really quickly. And I guarantee this has happened to you guys a lot, is that, you know, you get a week's worth of warm weather. If you think back to last year, we had really, really warm weather up in the Northeast and down here in the South too. We had a couple of weeks of, you know, high 80s, 90-degree weather, and the water temperature shot way up. And everybody around here at the house was talking about, okay, the fish are they're spawning. All of a sudden they're spawning. You know, in the last 2 weeks, we went from, you know, 50-degree water to 62-degree water. Now every fish in the lake is going to spawn, and that's not really the case. I've been around enough, and I've fished around enough lakes to know that it doesn't all happen at the same time. It's not going to all happen at once as soon as the fish start to spawn, and there's many, many things that are going to, you know, derail this and kick it back. Cold fronts being the optimum thing. You know as well as I do that, you know, you might get a week's worth of good weather, and all of a sudden things start to level off a little bit. You'll get a couple of those really cold evenings again. You know, you might get some severe fronts that come in for a couple of days, and it'll cool that water down. I've seen water temperatures go from, you know, 60, 65 degrees and then fall back 8 or 9 degrees. So that's going to have an effect on, you know, these fish moving up and starting to spawn. And they're only going to start to spawn really when they're comfortable, when the water temperature is stable, like a stable 62 degrees for a largemouth, a stable 57 for a smallmouth, and when they're ready. And a lot of that has to do with the moon phase too. And typically down south here, our very first wave of spawn happens in March. And we have what I call pretty much a 3-month phase of spawn. And that's, you know, March being the early spawners under that moon, April being the majority of the fish, and then May some stragglers that'll still spawn. And you know, we're going to look at some areas where that might be happening too. So for your case, if any of you guys live up north, and I know a few of my friends are on tonight listening that live up north, that's probably going to happen. You know, we're into May. You might have had a few fish go in April, you know, depending upon what your weather was like. I know some sections of the Northeast were a little bit warmer than others. So you may have had some fish go in April. The big wave of fish will be happening during this moon in May, and then a few more stragglers in June. If you happen to live in a really cold climate where, you know, you just had ice off a few weeks ago, you could be dealing with your first wave of fish spawning potentially, you know, under this moon in May, a few of them early, June being the big wave, and then even into July being some stragglers. So it's all relative to where you live, your weather, what's going on, the moon phase. All these things attribute to when and how the fish are going to spawn. So some thoughts to consider too, and this is kind of a thing that I hear from a lot of people, is that they always think that every fish in the lake is always going to spawn in the back of a creek, the back of a pocket, the back of a bay, and that is true for the majority. A big wave of fish will use those types of areas to spawn, and a lot of that is those resident fish that live in the creeks, live in the, you know, the backs of those big bays, and that's where they pretty much spend their entire life. But they don't all spawn in the back of a creek or the back of a bay, the back of a pocket. Sometimes the late spawners really like to use those main lake areas. If you look down, you know, perhaps right here, I've got 3 of these little pockets are kind of outlined right here. Great place to go find some late season fish that are spawning. They don't always, every one of them, swim out here from the main lake and swim all the way up into the backs of these creeks to go spawn and then come back out again. Fish will use the entire lake to spawn in, and some fish, majority fish, you may never even see spawning. They may, you know, especially smallmouths, will spawn a little bit deeper than largemouths, and you know, you get into some of your really clear lakes, and you know, some of those fish could spawn down in 8 or 10 foot deep, which you just never see them. They may use cover, boat docks, trees, grass, a lot of different variables to where they might spawn that that you may never see. And for every 1 fish that you see spawning, there's probably 100 that you don't. There's almost always a wave of early spawners. Like I said before, that happened for us probably in March, I would say, with the way our weather was. We had some fairly warm temperatures, lake temperatures, and our lake really never got horribly cold this year. It stayed a pretty constant temperature, which probably leads me to believe that some fish really spawn maybe even into February, but pretty much that first wave was March. You're always going to see some that'll spawn early. Like I said before, not every fish spawns in the back of a creek, back of a cove. And all fish do not spawn at the same time, like I've talked about as well. I've actually seen some of the biggest fish in the lake wait, and they spawn the latest. That's just, you know, what happens sometimes. Sometimes that wave of early spawners and the late ones are some of the biggest ones that you're going to catch. And then, you know, you still catch good ones obviously in the middle, but some of those real big ones early and then again late. And then, you know, obviously don't overlook late spawners in main lake areas, places where that get overlooked by a lot of people that you don't think a fish might be spawning in because, you know, you never thought about it or nobody's ever talked about it. But I guarantee you that main lake, little pockets, smaller pockets, little isolated areas, humps out in the middle of the lake, great places to go find some spawning fish that live their entire lake out in these structures. They never even see the back of a creek or the back of a pocket, the back of a cove. So keep an open mind when you're tending to look for, you know, these areas that they want to spawn on. And they're usually, you know, always going to try to spawn on some type of a, you know, fairly gravelly type bottom, something that's, you know, got a little bit of hard surface too. I've seen fish spawn on top of stumps. I've seen them spawn on top of rocks. I've seen them spawn on top of trees. Down here, down south, it's not uncommon for fish to actually use big marinas as well to spawn in, and they actually spawn in the outdrives of some of the boats. It's kind of a weird pattern to get into, but I have seen it before too. Spotted bass, which we have quite a few of down here, down south, love to do that. They love to just be, you know, out by themselves, and they'll use those big marina slips and spawn actually on the outdrives of the boats. And so I've seen some crazy stuff, but don't overlook some of those main lake areas, and kind of keep an open mind when you're looking for fish that are spawning. I'm not going to cover too much about the spawn. I kind of want to get into some of this post-spawn stuff. And this may be probably the hardest time of year to catch some fish, and we're dealing with it, you know, now. Although, if I can back up just slightly, if you think about this, go back to the beginning when I was talking about this period of time being the most complex to figure out. When you've got multiple different things happening all at the same time, or in different times, in different stages, it becomes pretty hard sometimes to pattern these fish, especially if you haven't been on the water a lot. The more you're on the water, the more equipped you are for figuring out what the fish are doing. And that's true for any type of pattern, any type of season that you fish in, but it's so the case in pre-spawn, spawn, and post-spawn, because fish do a lot of different things. All the fish that spawn in, say, February or March down here down south may already be right now in May in a summer pattern. Fish that spawned in the month of May here, or April into May, may be on that post-spawn pattern. There may even be some fish, like I said, I'm pretty sure I caught some that were still moving up. So there's still some pre-spawn fish, the last few that are moving up, you know, getting ready to spawn here in another couple of weeks. So it becomes complex when you're trying to figure these things out, because there's fish moving in, fish moving out, fish doing different things. And post-spawn fish can be frustrating to figure out how to catch them. And the best way that I can tell you is that a lot of times post-spawn fish will be on isolated types of cover. Boat docks, isolated trees, isolated points, isolated rocks, isolated grass beds, something that's a little bit different, but close to the areas where they spawned in. There's multiple ways to catch post-spawn fish. I'm going to show you a few of my favorites, and it's probably the best time of year to fish a topwater bait. A lot of people like to fish too slow. They fish on the bottom, maybe shaky worm, jig, Texas rig, Carolina rig, something like that. And when that scenario is going on, when the real post-spawn is in swing, a lot of those fish suspend. And they're the hardest to catch. Suspended fish are pretty hard to catch, but you need to fish above the fish. So if I'm fishing baits that are on the bottom, I'm not effectively fishing for those fish. So I want to fish stuff that's in their line of sight or above their line of sight, because that's the way a bass feeds. So it makes sense that top water fishing, even a jerk bait is really good, a square bill crankbait, something that's moving fast and moving in front of the line of sight is always going to be the best type of approach for trying to catch a post-spawn bass. And then isolation too. Try to hit as many isolated targets and pieces of cover as you possibly can. And that's probably my best advice for, you know, dealing with this post-spawn blues. It can be a fantastic time to catch some fish. And actually, for me, to be real honest with you, my fishing didn't start off. I had a couple tournaments early this year, and one was severely pre-spawn, really cold, 16-degree temperatures out. It was one of those classic deals when, if you remember back to the beginning here, talking about cold fronts, we had a nice little warm up. The water temperature got to be about 58, 60 degrees. things were looking great. And then we had a giant cold front down here, down south, and it was 16 degrees during the first 3 days of practice. It never got above 20. Little bit of wind, but not too much. You know, the patterns have a tendency to fall apart when you're dealing with that sort of situation. But over the last, I'd say 3 weeks or so, things have really stabilized quite a bit. And my post-spawn fishing so far this year has been really good. I've been on a couple of really good topwater patterns and some other stuff I'm going to show you too. I've actually took a screenshot of a place where I was just fishing a tournament, and I'm going to kind of relate to you a little bit about how I went to go find some of those fish, and you know, some of the tools that I used to help me locate those fish. So the next thing, location. All I did was take a little screenshot of a back section of a creek. And one of the best patterns that I can think of for fishing post-spawn fish is taking advantage of boat docks. And if I can find places where these fish spawn, we're going to use this creek, for example, and say they spawn back in this back section of the creek here, or this back section of the creek here, or these couple little pockets right here off of the main creek, you know, pretty shallow flat right here, pretty flat area there, shallow back in here, another flat right there. The logical place for these fish to go, and they don't stray, and I'm talking about the biggest fish, you know, the female bass that just spawned. They're going out and they're going to find some isolated cover. They're going to try to eat as much as they can before they migrate out the creek, or maybe they stay in one of these creek channels throughout the course of the day, throughout the course of the year. Maybe they live their whole life in this creek, or they migrate out to the main lake. But they're going to feed up, and they're going to feed up really good. They like isolation. So, you know, there's a boat dock right here, and a boat dock right here, and a boat dock right there, and right there. Those would be the ones that I would target first, because they're the closest to those areas where they spawned. They might eventually be on some of these other ones. As they migrate out, they might stop. And here's another really unique place. Say fish spawn back here in this little pocket right here. Well, we've got 3 boat docks on the outside of this main creek, but we've also got a roadbed right here. Now you've got 2 sets of structures that, okay, and that's that pattern within a pattern that you hear about quite a bit, and things that I talk about quite a bit is, yeah, I was catching them off of boat docks, but what specifically attracted that fish to that particular boat dock? Was it a drop in, you know, bottom depth? Was it a contour change? Was it brush on the boat dock? Was it the type of boat dock too? All these factors really contribute to what the fish will be, you know, gravitated towards. But right here, we've got a roadbed that runs right up to the bank, right almost into the edge of this spawning pocket, and it goes almost across 3 different boat docks. So that right there, that little bit of information, and this is, you know, my Navionics Platinum card right here, and it's an invaluable tool, and you'll see it. I'm going to show you some other slides here coming up for being able to find this stuff. If I did not have this chart on my Lowrance machine, I wouldn't know that that's there. I might be able to see it on a regular map, but I'm going to see it a whole lot quicker having it on my screen, being back here catching spawning fish, and now they go post-spawn, and now I need to find some places to go. It's obvious. Right there, right there, right there, right there, and right here. And also, possibly there too. That little section of roadbed that's on the outside edge of this little spawning pocket right here, they may move right there. So pretty easy to, you know, if you've got the right tools to be able to find out exactly the right places to go and fish. And so that Navionics Platinum chip, it is absolutely probably one of my most valuable tools all throughout the year, but especially this time of year when I'm trying to find specific pieces of cover that these fish will gravitate towards. So some of my favorite patterns, and this is a deal that I've been on for about the past couple of weeks right now, is fishing boat docks. And the thing about a boat dock is It's kind of hard to fish a topwater underneath the boat dock unless you're skipping a frog up under there, which is a pretty cool deal to catch them too. But I like to rig a wacky rig Senko through the middle and skip it up under the boat docks. That is a really, really cool way to catch them. And if you look, I was actually out over the weekend fishing a little charity tournament. And one of the patterns that I was catching some fish on in practice, although it didn't materialize during the tournament, was fishing boat docks that were pretty close to the areas where the fish spawn, but that had bluegill present underneath the docks. Any of these docks that I found that had either some kind of bait fish or bluegills, you could go and skip that wacky rig Senko. Usually a green pumpkin, a watermelon, or green pumpkin purple green is probably my favorite color because it really represents a bluegill well. Skipping that on just a regular old 7-foot medium action rod, bait cast. You can skip a 5-inch Senko on a bait casting rod pretty easy. 14-pound test monofilament line. Skip it under there, and I usually give it 3 or 4 or 5 seconds to fall, and if something hadn't eaten it by then, I'm going to shake it a couple of times, let it fall again, shake it maybe a couple more times, and if I hadn't got bit in the first maybe 10 or 15 seconds, I'm just winding up and I'm throwing back out, going to skip it up under another place. It's a pretty, even though you're fishing a bait without a weight, it's a pretty fast approach. These fish are going to react on it. You're skipping that bait up under the dock. It kind of represents colorations of a bluegill, kind of looks like, and it's got that fall that really triggers those lethargic fish into bite, and it's falling in front of them, falling through the water column. They're going to react on it pretty quick. So as we saw in the previous slide, choose areas in close proximity to where the spawning was taking place. That's pretty straightforward right there, as you saw on that other slide. Not every dock is the same. When I was fishing the past few days, I would find that, and this is true for most cases when you're dock fishing too, is that docks with wooden posts are the best. Those old metal docks, they don't have a lot of character, number one. The wooden docks just, they contain some algae and plankton and other matter that bluegills eat and shad eat and all these different things. So, wooden docks, those are the ones I'm really trying to stress if I'm looking for some as opposed to others, wooden ones. And also very large boathouses, depending on the type of lake that you're fishing, where you're fishing. If you've got those really big boathouses, have a ton of shade under them, have a lot of places for, fish to hide. And I'm trying to skip my bait or skip that Senko into areas where people aren't throwing. A lot of times it's in between a boat and, the interior, like almost garage portion of the boathouse where you drive your boat in, skip your bait up under there, try to skip it in underneath the walkways between the shore and the dock. A lot of people forget that portion. They fish the outside edges and all around, but they never try to get their bait up underneath the dock. And the more pressured the fish get under the docks and the brighter the sun gets, the more they're going to move back. So I try to, when I'm approaching a dock, is to try to fish every little area, every little crevice, every little place that I can to try to get my bait where other people can't. And every single fish almost that I caught in the past few days on a boat dock was between the shoreline and the actual boat. They were up underneath those walkways. And that's just where a lot of times where they like to hang out. So I did see somebody had their hand raised for a question. I don't know if Ross, you want to take a question now, or while he's thinking about it, or do you want to just keep on going?
Mike, I didn't catch the hand raised. We do have a couple of questions. One of them we'll address at the end. It's a unique, specific lake situation that you're familiar with. But a gentleman asked the question about, and I'm going to expand upon his question, but he asked about that transition time between the bed and kind of that post-spawn. Is it instantaneous? This gentleman's name is Mike. He feels like maybe I think he's basically saying he thinks there's a time in between that. Is he kind of misunderstanding the situation? How quick do they go from the beds to a post-spawn scenario?
It could possibly happen in a day or two. It's so hard to pinpoint exactly how long it takes, but I've fished around enough spawning fish to see them one day and not see them the next day. And then the following day start catching them on, other areas, that it could happen very, very quickly. The cool thing about fishing this time of year is, like I said before, that not all fish do the same thing. So just because one group of fish is not there anymore doesn't mean that you can't go find another group of fish to go fish for. So it's not like every single one spawns at the same time and is doing the same thing and is post-spawn at the same time. Certain fish will be quicker than others. So, there's always something happening. But there is a short window of opportunity. I can't, lake to lake is a little bit different. I've seen it, be only a couple of days, and I've seen it be a little bit longer, but it's not an exorbitant amount of time between when they, especially the females, when they leave the beds and they go search alternate pieces of cover, it's fairly quick for them. The male bass that are sitting there in the nest guarding the fry, they're going to be around for quite a while, and they're going to guard those fry. They're going to guard the nest, first, and then, then they're going to guard the fry once they're there. And that may not necessarily be the same spot where the bed was. It may be, again, could be a boat dock, could be an isolated piece of cover, it could be the very same spots that the female fish were using to rest up, maybe the same spots that, the male that's guarding the fries will be around. Maybe it could be deeper water. We have a lot of situations here down south when the fish aren't necessarily, the guarders, I should say, aren't necessarily on pieces of cover, but they're out off the bank, suspended a little bit, guarding those fry. And I'm thinking, my theory behind that is that even though they're out a little bit deeper, they're still protected by some of the brim and crappie and other things that are trying to move shallower to also spawn, which is coming up here in a little bit, which I'm going to talk about. So that's kind of my theory on that. But, it's not that's the only place they'll be. They'll be around, grass and docks and all kinds of cover as well, guarding those fries. So,
okay.
That's about as best as I can answer that question.
Okay. And then gentleman by the name of Mario has got a question here. And I think this is it's a good one. And Mario, I'm going to adjust your question a little bit. But he's asking the question about when the water reaches, he says the water is 68 degrees where he's at right now, and they're kind of moving up, but they seem to almost move on and off the beds. Maybe it's a cold front situation, maybe it's a water temperature situation. How are you, Mike, deciding if those fish are done or if those fish are just moving up and the weather's pushing them back off? What are you looking for to key in on that, and then kind of some lure ideas at the same time?
Yeah, that's a good question. And actually, do you know where Mario lives?
I don't. He did not tell me.
Okay, that would be. I would like to know that information because, like I said, geographically different thing. Even though it's 68 degrees, he could live up in. Let's say I'm going to be in Maine in another week, and I know for a fact that 5 days ago, the water temperature in Maine was 52 degrees. They had a 75-degree day and an 80-degree day Thursday and Friday, and I think a 70-degree day on Saturday. They had 3 days worth of good weather. So it's not uncommon that water temperature could come up a quick 10 degrees, bringing it to 62. So if that's the case, you would think in your mind that all the fish are going to go spawn. Well, not the case. They don't all go with this. Just because surface temperature is 62 or 68 doesn't mean that these fish are ready. So that's why I'm kind of intrigued where he lives.
Well, he lives in Oregon.
Okay.
He said that the water just got above 60 degrees in the last few days. So he might be describing kind of what you're talking about.
Absolutely. So what's happening, that's a classic, what I call a cruiser situation. So those fish are starting to realize that, hey, you know, our winter's over. Things are starting to warm up. We're kind of done with our pre-spawn. We're moving up shallow. We're going to search out some areas where we think we want to spawn, but we're not ready yet because it's, you know, we know it kind of biologically that, you know, we may have some cold fronts. It's not, we're just not ready yet. But although we're getting, you know, ready because it's, you know, it's starting to warm up. So those fish are cruising around looking for places. They're looking for suitable places to spawn. Like I said, you know, some of those sandy kind of gravelly banks. Maybe there's some stumps or trees or cover, or some rocks or grass or whatever it might be. And they're going to kind of search out some areas and fan out some beds. So those are hard fish to catch. They're pretty easy when they're really pre-spawn and you know, they're close to where they're going to spawn, but they're not up there cruising around yet. And you know, that's when you can catch them real good on a little scorebill crankbait, a little spinnerbait, chatterbait, those sorts of things that, you know, they're pretty aggressive and hungry at that point. But when they get up and they start looking for places that they're really not on a feeding mood, so you need to kind of throw some baits that will kind of catch those cruising fish. And if you see them kind of cruising back and forth, and you know, it seems like you throw a bait at them and they swim away from it, or it just spooks them away. A couple of things that I've found, and a couple of weird things that work. If you've ever seen these, and you can buy them for about 98 cents at a Walmart, these pre-rigged Kelly worms. This is, I'm kind of surprised I'm telling you guys this, because it's one of them. It's a little trick that not hardly anybody fishes. Those pre-rigged K&E or a Kelly worm, it's got 3 little Aberdeen gold hooks on it, and usually a propeller on the front. And you put it on a spinning rod on about 8 or 10 pound test line, or maybe even some braid, and you throw it at the bank and you wind it in, and that worm has got kind of a kink in it. So when you wind it, it kind of rotates around, it spins around like a helicopter. And what I usually do is I'll put a little barrel swivel on it so that it doesn't twist my line up. And I'm almost guaranteed if you throw that thing at a fish that's just swimming down the bank, he is going to swim over and he is going to eat it. It's a crazy deal. It's something I learned a long time ago, and it's something that really catches them good. A traditional wacky rig Senko, but not the 5-inch version, and I'm going to skip under a dock. I like that little tiny 3-inch version, the real small one. Something that's really small profile. You'd rig that, you know, the same way, rig it wacky style, and you can stay away from the fish and actually almost skip that bait right to the bank almost. That's an important thing too, is trying to stay away from them. That's another really good technique for catching them. And the other thing too is an original floating number 11 gold Rapala minnow bait. Put it on a spinning rod, throw it right to the bank. A couple of twitches, it'll bob down a little bit and then float back up to the surface. That's another really good way for catching those fish that are just kind of cruising around, kind of uninterested in eating, and are really, you know, concerned about finding some places to go spawn. Those are probably the 3 best ways that I know to catch those fish.
Okay. Do you have a couple more slides?
Yeah, sure do.
Okay, go ahead and keep going. We got a great question from Derek. We'll ask it towards the end. Derek, I appreciate your question. Hold on and we'll get you answered up.
Very cool. All right, so here's another pattern, and this obviously is this is kind of a geographic thing. For those of you who fish lakes and live around lakes that have shad, there's 2 really cool deals that happen in conjunction with the end of the bass spawn, or around the end of when at least one of the wave or 2 of the waves of bass have finished spawning. And the first one is called a shad spawn, and that's just about over here right now. It was really good for about 3 weeks, and that's when the shad will spawn. And it is typically occurs when some of the fish are first going post spawn, usually triggered by about 70-degree water temperature or stable.
Folks, hold on just a second for me. I'm not sure what's going on, but we seem to have lost Mike. Give me just a minute. We'll see if we can get him back. I apologize for this slight delay here. Give me just a minute. There's technical difficulties here. We've obviously lost Mike because he's not sharing his screen anymore. I'm going to jump back on and take over. We've got a couple of great questions. As soon as we get Mike back, I apologize about the delay here. We will absolutely get your questions answered and get him back to the webinar. These things, unfortunately, sometimes happen, and this appears to be right in the middle of it. So let's see what happens if we get him back right away. I just got a text from him, so I'm sure he's telling me that he's going to be back on in 60 seconds here. Oh, he just said 1 second, folks. We apologize. Luckily, Mike is nice and calm. This is not his first rodeo, so. We appear to have lost him for a minute. He is scrambling by his text message, so I apologize for the very minor delay. Okay, we're back up and running. Apologize about the minor delay here, folks. Mike's going to reshare his screen. We're going to get back on track. And the beauty of it is when somebody looks in a week, we will edit all this stuff out. It's just like live television.
Okay, do I have to share screen one more time, right?
Yes, sir. Okay, we're back up. Guys, keep the questions coming. Mike, take back over. I'm going to shut my video off and mute myself again. You were on, actually, you were on this, this screen right here. So we're good to go. We're back up.
Okay. Sorry, everybody, for that technology. Anyway, wish it was as easy as the shad spawn. Anyway, so this is, like I was talking about, was happening. And there may still be a little bit of shad spawn going on down here in the south, depending upon, obviously, the lake. I live in Tennessee. I saw a little bit of it over the weekend still going on, but some of your lakes that are a little bit further north may be in full swing right now. But it's usually triggered by that 70-degree water temperature. It occurs in multiple areas and also unpredictable areas. So if you find fish on the shad spawn one day on, say, a bluff wall, and you go back there the next day, they might not be there anymore. So I try to keep my mind open to different areas that include, riprap walls, seawalls, grass, lily pads, very deep boat docks. That seems to be a really, really good one that a lot of these shad will get up on these deep boat docks, 30, 40, 50 foot deep, on bluff banks or steeper banks, or those big giant boathouses on some of your clear lakes, and those fish will suspend up underneath the boat docks, and that's a great time to throw a swim bait or a top water bait or stuff like that. Regular bluff walls too as well. The shad will get up and they'll spawn, and I'll try to find areas too. You can prolong the window of opportunity that you've got. Typically, it's about the first hour of the morning is critical. So the earlier you can get out on the water, it's getting sun up now about 6 o'clock here down south. I'm sure it's probably the same up there in the Northeast. So you can be out on the water at fairly early. It'll be happening right away, I guarantee it. And it's usually over by about 8 o'clock. It's done for the day. And then fishing gets really, really tough. For whatever reason, these fish they just stop biting for a while. And you'll get a little bit of late morning into the afternoon perk up from some of these fish, and they'll start biting again. But that first hour or two in the morning is really, really critical. But I'll try to prolong that a little bit by trying to fish areas of the lake and let the sun dictate, or the rising of the sun dictate. So I'm going to pick certain places where, if I've got a situation where I can go fish a particular bank where the sun is coming up and the sun's going to shine on that bank, I'll go hit it quick while it's still low light, and then I'll get on over to the other side of the lake and where it's protected from the sun, and go fish some of that. So it'll prolong things a little bit and give you a little bit more window of opportunity, maybe an extra half hour or something like that to take advantage of this shad spawn. But it's a really, really cool pattern. And several years ago, I was fishing a tournament at Lake Eufaula in Alabama, and it was May. In fact, it was May, the first week of May, 7th, 8th, 9th, something like that, 10th, right around there. And I had a pretty decent practice. And if you've ever had this scenario where you're driving around the lake and you happen to look at a particular bank and you say, well, I want to stop and fish that bank, and then you never do. I did it every single day of practice. And this particular little bank was less than a half a mile from where we were taking off. Because I was passing it every day coming in and leaving. And I'd look at it and go, it's a pretty good looking bank, and had a little bit of grass and some scattered lily pads and other things. And most of my fish were biting a little bit later in the day, and I wasn't on the shad spawn. It really hadn't got the full swing yet. And the first day of the tournament, I got an early boat draw, and I said, I got nothing to lose. My fish aren't biting till late. Let me stop on this bank. I stopped on that bank, and the shad spawn was going full swing that morning. I had a limit in the boat in the first 45 minutes, and in fact, a pretty good limit. They gave me some time to settle down and cull up a few fish later in the day. And I wasn't leading the tournament, but I think I was in second or third the first day. And, just from taking a hunch and stopping on that bank. So second day I got a late boat draw, so I missed the shad spawn. And the third day I made the cut and went back, and they were catching them again on that particular bank. So it could be different every single day. Could be a myriad of different things. So keep an open mind. If you've got that situation, you live on a lake that's got some shad, or you're fishing a lake that's got some shad, give it a try. It's a really, really fun way to fish. It's a fun way also to fish some of my favorite baits. A swim jig, usually a little quarter ounce. I like, if I'm fishing fairly shallow stuff, I like that quarter ounce swim jig. And if I'm fishing those deep boat docks, one of the things you can do too is you can get like maybe a 3/8 swim jig and put a little trail like this little shad shaped worm, or a little double tail Yamamoto trail on the back of this, and skip it up underneath those boat docks and kind of twitch it and let it fall just a tiny bit, and that'll trigger those fish into biting. You can also take a chatterbait, which is one of my favorite baits, and also put that as another one of my little secrets. Yamamoto's got a new trailer out for their chatterbaits called the Zako swim bait, and it's really, really good. And before that, I had always fished a shad-shaped worm. This is a drop shot bait that they make. It's a little finesse bait. It's good on a little shaky head. It's good on a drop shot, but it's phenomenal on the back of a chatterbait, and it's great on the back of a swing jig. So just a little bit, something that's unconventional. The fish don't get to see. It's got a tremendous amount of action. Obviously, a buzz bait, you can't go shed spawn, post spawn fishing without having a buzz bait tied on. And if the wind's blowing or the fish don't want to come up for your buzz bait, I'm going to fish a spinner bait. So reaction style baits, something that's going to trigger a bite, something that looks like a shad. Something that I don't have in there too is a swim bait. There's a variety, a ton of different things you can use the shad spawn, but those four things are kind of my go-to baits because I can cover a lot of water quick. They're all single hook baits too, so I don't have to worry about trying to get them unhooked with a with a crankbait or a square bill or something like that. I can get them off pretty quick, which is why I kind of like these single hook baits. You don't have a lot of time when you're dealing with shad spawn, so the quicker I can get them in the boat, the quicker I can get them, you know, in my live well if I'm fishing a tournament, or get them released and catch another one. Single hook baits, kind of, you see the theme there. So kind of a cool little deal. Here's something that's, excuse me, that's a little bit more prevalent in virtually every single lake that you can fish from one end of the country to the other. And it's the bluegill spawn. And this is actually going on right now. This is one of the deals that I look to fish. And actually I fished a little charity tournament over the weekend. And I'm pretty convinced that where we were catching these fish and how we were catching these fish, that's exactly what they were keying in on. And I practiced for another tournament that I've got coming up, and I'm pretty convinced that that's exactly what these fish are doing too, is that these fish are around all these big post-spawn females leaving the spawning beds, and at the same time shad spawn's going on. Maybe that's the first wave of fish or into the second wave, but the second wave into the third wave is keyed in on this bluegill spawn. So it's kind of the bluegill spawn happens a slight bit later than the shad spawn. It's about, bluegill spawn will happen like in the low 70s, 72 to, you know, it's about 74 degrees here right now, and it's in full swing, and it happens pretty much from the end of May throughout the entire month of June. So it's a really cool little deal. The backs of pockets, coves and creeks, little ditches. I live on Douglas Lake in Tennessee, and we have a lot of these little ditches or hollows that are like sandied out little back pockets, and they love to spawn in the backs of those. Anything that's sandy flat points, that's where I've been catching quite a few fish. These sandy flat rounded points that look like nothing's down there at all, and 3 to 5 foot of water, you look down, you see bluegill beds, or grassy areas too, bulrush grass, pencil reeds, reedy areas, that sort of thing, or, you know, coontail or hydrilla, milfoil, that sort of stuff, and those little holes in that, those bluegills will get down there and spawn. So pretty cool other pattern, and that is the way to catch a really, really big bass sometimes. Some of those big ones, they're really keyed in on to eating those bluegills, and that's the kind of pattern that you can actually exploit all day long. Whereas, you know, the shad spawn is a relatively small window. This bluegill spawn, you can do it all day long, but it's especially good in the morning as well. And that's, you know, another time when, you know, top water comes in, and, you know, of course I'm going to have my my chatter bait, and I kind of like to change up trailers a little bit, whereas the shad spawn, I'm going to go with that smaller trailer, the shad-shaped worm, something a little bit smaller profile. I want to go with a little bigger, bulkier bait now. I'm going to go with this Zako swim bait, and you notice that it's a fairly wide body kind of fish segmented tail with a little fork tail, and it gives it a little bit bigger profile. It's got a great swimming action. You can wind your chatterbait really slow with it, which I like too, and great pairing of a chatterbait or vibrating jig with this Zako swim bait. Obviously, wacky rig Senko, which is something that, you know, you can't go post spawn bluegill fishing without. When those fish sun starts to get up a little bit, the fish start to get a little bit more lethargic. They're not really chasing around as much as they were earlier in the day. You need to throw a much slower presentation, something that gets right in their face. That wacky rig Senko again, green pumpkin, watermelon, green pumpkin, purple green, watermelon red, something like that. Looks like a bluegill. Perfect deal. And then two of my favorites right here is what I've been catching quite a few fish on the last couple of weeks, is a popping frog and a bluegill color, and also a walking bait like this skitter walk, also in a bluegill color. And the thing that I like about these two particular baits, topwater baits, is unlike say a buzz bait, which I've got to, you know, maintain at a fairly steady retrieve to keep it on top of the water. I can really slow these two baits down and keep them in that strike zone, because those bass aren't necessarily right on the bluegill beds. They're just off of them. They're kind of, you know, patrolling around and cruising around and looking for their opportunity. And when the opportunity strikes, they're going to run in there and grab a big bluegill and then come back out into maybe it's 5 to 6, 7 foot of water. So they're just going to be just off the bluegill beds a little bit. So I can throw both of those baits and work them slowly and keep them in front of the strike zone of that fish the longest period of time that I can. And that just allows me to get more and more bites. So a pretty straightforward approach to, several baits. I might start out, the first thing I do first thing in the morning is maybe throw this chatterbait around a little bit. And then as the sun starts to come up a little bit more, maybe, go with the walker and the popping frog. And then, as 10, 11 o'clock comes rolling around, I still want to catch some bluegill spawn fish, go to the wacky rig Senko. And I may, rotate around some of these other baits just because the sun's up doesn't mean they won't bite at topwater, because they will. I've seen them bite them all day long when they're post spawn and when they're on this bluegill spawn deal. You just need to, recognize when to put one down and pick up the other, and I'll rotate around all of these baits until I figure out what they want the best. So hopefully that's when I'm going to be fishing tomorrow and the rest of this week here a little bit. So here's probably one of the most important things too, is that selecting areas, and this is another example of where your Navionics chip, my platinum chip, really comes in handy with what I'm fishing. So a lot of times, these bluegills will spawn on these little secondary points out from some of the spawning areas. Like if they spawn back up in here in this little pocket or back up there in that little pocket, there's a little secondary point right there. That's a good choice. There's one right there, and there's one right there, and there's one right there, and there's another one right there. So we've got 3 or 4 of them in a row. So if they spawn back in these pockets, they're going to pull out to these little secondary points. But you notice that the one thing that I'm looking for with respect to these 2 spots that I've got circled is contour lines. And that's important. I don't want to pick, maybe this type of a point where the contour lines are closer together because that's a sharper drop. I want to pick points or secondary points that have a more sloping point out into the deeper water. That's the kind of stuff where the bluegills are going to want to spawn on, those flatter areas. And having that Navionics chip in my machine lets me find these places without having to dig out my map, go run around. It just saves me a ton of time on the water, having all that information right on my screen. If I get into a situation where I pull into this cove and I catch some, or I've been catching some spawning fish back in these pockets, and I kind of think to myself, well, the next logical place for them to be is to come out here to this little secondary point, especially if I see some bluegill spawning. Now that keys me into, getting some bites, and I can quickly go look on my map and go, come out of this little pocket and come running down the bank and come drive right into there and go, okay, let's check this out. Once I get through with this, I can get on the lake and I can kind of run down. So, let's maybe check this point out. Maybe let's check that point out. Maybe let's check this one out. All these ones that have the same kind of characteristics as where I've been catching them is where I can focus on, and having that chip in my boat on my Lowrance units is an invaluable tool that helps save me a ton of time when I'm out in the water. I got into a situation last week fishing a tournament. I got every once in a while you get pretty lucky and you stumble upon a pattern, and it happens quick. And I like in practice when that happens because it lets me focus in more and really refine that pattern. I got it pretty refined by the time tournament came. And any of you guys that do fish tournaments, that I guarantee you whatever you do in practice is going to be different during the tournament. And that's pretty much always the case. And people ask me, well, I've done this for 32 years for a living. You ought to be pretty good at fishing. How do you go practice for it? You should know how to catch some fish. And it's really trying to figure out some scenarios of what they're doing now, what they've done all week, and what they could possibly be doing when the tournament comes around and they're not doing it anymore. What do you go and do? So that's kind of the situation that I got into. And this is what's going on here more than that initial real big post spawn is the last steps before these fish get out into their summer pattern. So it's important to realize that not all fish go out to the main lake and go, swim all the way back 3 miles up a creek, go spawn, and then swim back out to the lake. They just don't do that. A lot of these fish we call resident fish. They live back in those pockets, back in those coves, back in those creeks their entire life. They never see the main lake. They don't even know it's there. That's where they live. Other fish, maybe ones that don't know the creeks are there, live out in the main lake their whole life. Some fish may migrate into pockets or little coves close to the main lake or main channel, and then they move out. But they're going to use certain places as stopping points before they get to their summertime stuff, regardless if they're resident fish that live up in a creek or fish that live out in the main lake. They're going to use these places. And one of the best places I can think of is a roadbed. And this is, I don't know if I would have been able to find any of this stuff had it not been for this chip. I had some places in mind that I wanted to go look at to go find some fish, and I got keyed into this roadbed bite. And you'll notice that, and I'm going to zoom this out here in the next slide so you can see the bigger picture, but this is a hump that comes off of the main lake. Main channel is right here. Pretty tight contour line, so a pretty tight drop. I got to figure out how to go back. I go back right there. And so pretty tight contour lines right there. And you'll notice that on this other side of the hump, this is the shallowest part of the hump, contour lines far apart. So more of a sloping bank here, sloping bank there, a little bit of a depression or a saddle right here. On this other side, you'll probably see it when I go to the next slide, is that there's another hump on down the bank, down the piece of structure, I should say, and a little saddle right here. And there's a series of 3 or 4 little humps. This was the best piece, though. I'd caught some fish off of the other pieces, but this was the best one because of this. And it has to do, I talked about it before when we were looking at boat docks, is the pattern within a pattern, is that I was catching those fish right on this drop. This was 8 foot of water right here that had the roadbed running across. Those were my best 2 spots. I caught some fish here up on the shallowest, flattest piece of this, where this roadbed runs across this hump, and then out into deeper water. But I had caught most of them right there on those 2 spots right there. So having my Navionics chip in there and getting on this and fishing around, and it wasn't until I actually started to fish around a little bit that I realized that, okay, the reason these fish are here is because of a roadbed. So I said, well, okay, where else can I go? And can I look for roadbeds that run in that 8 to 10 foot zone? And regardless if they were out in the middle of the lake, here's the other humps I was telling you about. I caught some fish here. I caught a few here, but most of them are right there in this spot right here. This roadbed runs. It runs over across here. It runs here. I never did catch any over here in this section, but I followed it one day over here, and right there it's about 8 to 10 foot of water. I caught them here, and I caught them on this bend right here. Fish like different things, and roadbeds and structures like that are no different. You look at both of these spots, the roadbed makes a little bend right here, and it bends from the shallow to this deep, and then it actually falls off into the channel. Perfect little transition spot right there. Transition spots coming up out of the deep water right here up to about 10 foot. Makes a little bend right there. This was the section that I caught all my fish in, and this was the section I caught all my fish in here. Although they're the same in different areas, they have a lot of similarities to them. So using your Navionics chip to its greatest potential, whether you're fishing roadbeds or any other type of cover, it's an invaluable tool that you can use to put it in your unit and duplicate your pattern all over the lake. And I've done it many, many, many times, regardless of what type of cover, what type of situation is. It's saves you a ton of time out in the water trying to locate spots where fish are going to be. Just one example, I had probably 20 different roadbeds that I had found after, I found this the first day of practice and got keyed on it pretty quick. So then once I started to develop the pattern, I would look actually on my paper map back at the hotel and look at some spots and go, okay, I want to check this spot out, that spot out. But I found quite a few more on the chip that were not on the paper map. So a lot of times you'll get into that scenario too, where you'll see stuff on this, on your chart that you won't see on the paper map. And I had a couple of spots there that were really good ones too, that weren't on the paper map, but I found them here on the card. So just a pretty cool scenario on how to catch them. And the cool thing with a pattern like this, I had one of my best spots, and I don't have a slide of this one, but it was another little tiny point with a roadbed that runs across, and it had some stumps on it. And in the morning time, I started actually on that spot first thing in the morning, and I had a bunch of bites, and I broke one off, and I lost one, and I caught a bunch of small fish. But it was the type of deal where they were biting totally different during the tournament. We had a cold front, going back to that first slide again, what's going to derail your pattern, cold fronts. We had rain on a Friday. It seems like every tournament that you fish on a Saturday, it rains on a Friday. And that's what happened, and muddied the water up a little bit, cooled the water down a little bit, changed the fishing a little bit, changed the way. They weren't biting as good in the morning as they had been. And I was catching all my fish dragging a football jig on these road beds. And I went back to that one area in the afternoon, and I had I actually didn't even have a limit at that point. And I was really scrambling around trying to find some fish. And I pulled up right where I had a section of waypoints, just like, this roadbed right here. And pulled up to it and didn't even have a bite this time in the afternoon. So I said, well, let me follow this roadbed out a little bit. I followed it out to that 8 to 10 foot zone, and I found an entire school of fish right there on one little piece out in the middle of nowhere, and caught, I don't even know how many, probably 20 or 25 fish in the last 40 minutes of the tournament, and 3 of them were the right ones, and that ended up, let me catch a limit and have a pretty good finish in that tournament just by making one slight little adjustment. So I guess another lesson to be learned is, just because you're catching a lot of them in one particular spot, when you stop catching them or things change like they usually will, think about the logical place where those fish could go. And that's all I did, is I just kind of followed this roadbed out. They're still associated or following the roadbed or attracted the roadbed. They're just using a different piece of it. So that's the cool thing about locating and using your map chips to find places like this, is that you can usually find them again if you lost them. So pretty cool little scenario, and something that I'm going to look at next time I go fish this lake. So just to kind of review, and before we've got any questions here, is that realize the spawn can last for several months. It could still be going on down south where I live a little bit, but any of you guys that live up north, you're probably just beginning or just into it. So you've got another, good 4, 6, 7, 8 weeks worth of spawn before they go post spawn. It's controlled by many factors, like we said, like cold fronts and weather changes and moon phases and all this sorts of things. And the post spawn doesn't have to be complicated. I try to find some isolated pieces of cover. Don't overthink things. Don't fish below the fish. Fish top water baits. Fish jerk baits. Fish something that's in the line of the bass's sight or above the line of the bass's sight, and look for isolated pieces of cover. And you'll usually find some post spawn fish. Recognize these obscure patterns too that not a lot of guys are doing, like the shad spawn, the bluegill spawn, and finally look for transition areas before the fish moosh out, whether they're road beds like you saw, or main lake points, or little ditches, or channel swings. Any of these things are transition places that bass use to go from point A to point B, to get from where they're going to be to where they're going to go. And one other thing too on these transition areas, that if you'd been fishing in the pre-spawn phase and you'd caught them on specific places, more than likely that's where they're going to go after they're kind of done with that initial post-spawn, before they get into transition and go to summer. They go back to those real pre-spawn areas, and then they move out into their summer transition. So if you knew where they were, you kind of know where they're going to go, and they've been. you can kind of follow them in and out of these places. And of course, having that Navionics map is a real invaluable tool for being able to do that. And like I kind of end every one of these Navionics webinars with, have fun when you're out there fishing. Don't assume that everything you do is going to work. Keep an open mind, have fun fishing. That's what it's all about. Try to catch some fish. Check out the Navionics website. Check out Bass Pro Shops. I've also got a Facebook fan page. It's Mike Delvisco Fishing. I am pretty active on it, and I do answer any and all questions pretty much on a daily basis. I may not get to them right away, but I will eventually, hopefully get to them in a day or two. So you guys can log on, jump on there, like my page, follow where I'm going, check me out and ask me some questions. And also, the cool thing about doing these webinars too is that they save a copy, like Ross was talking about, and they'll be on the Navionics YouTube page that you guys can go back for reference and look at it anytime. And we've kind of done this a little bit backwards. I did a summertime one and I've done a fall one, but I hadn't done a spring one yet. So now we've got spring, summer, and fall, and I'll probably end up doing a winter one at some point too, which, you'll have all 4 seasons. But you can go back and watch any one of those, any one of mine, any of the other guys that have done these webinars, and get a ton of great, useful information right there anytime you want. So Ross, I appreciate it. If we got any questions, we got some time to do that, I'll be sure to answer them.
Yeah, Mike, we've got a number of questions. The first one we're going to address is from Derek. And Derek was wondering about, and this is going to hold true beyond just where he's at. Now, he's talking about East Tennessee for post-spawn. His water temperature is 79 to 84, upland reservoir. What kind of patterns is he looking for? And I'm going to throw in my piece to this question, Derek. How much are you keying in on water temperature during that post-spawn bite?
Yeah, and East Tennessee is, that's my wheelhouse. It's where I live. So I'm sure he's probably talking about all these lakes, and we've got 7 or 8 of them here in East Tennessee. Each one of them's a little bit different. I live on Douglas, and it's a fairly deep, clear lake. It's got a lot of deep water, a lot of rocky stuff. But if you get, a little bit west of here over to Loudon or Watts Bar, which are more river-like lakes, they're quite a bit shallower. It seems like if his water temperature is about that temperature, it seems like that might be where he's looking or fishing. But because ours is a little bit colder than that right now, the post-spawn, and like I said before, it doesn't all happen at the same time. So I'm sure there's a number of fish already in a lot of our East Tennessee lakes that are definitely, without a doubt, in the summer pattern right now on those ledges, out on those deeper drops, out on those deeper points. There's also, and in case in point, I fished a tournament, cherry tournament over the weekend in East Tennessee on Watts Bar, and I caught all my fish in 2 foot of water fishing, a bluegill spawn. Guys that also did very well were out fishing deep ledges. So they were fishing for fish that had already moved out from post-spawn. I'm pretty confident that the fish that I was catching was those transition fish from their initial post-spawn into, that transition phase where they're eventually gonna leave and go out. Although thinking about where I caught them, they may just live there too. Because I caught them way, way, way back up in the end of a creek where, it's kind of hard for me to believe that they're going to swim all the way, 5 miles out into the lake, to go spend their summer. They're probably going to live in that creek somewhere because it's got plenty of deep water in it. So I guess I kind of got off track. What was his question about post-spawn?
What kind of patterns are you looking for? Basically.
Yeah. Yeah. And pretty much what I described here in the post-spawn, frog fishing and dock fishing, throwing that chatterbait, that's exactly everything you saw on this screen is what's sitting in my boat right now. That's what I'm targeting, those post-spawn fish, because they're not, they're just not going to go from spawning areas out to deep water. They're going to be in that, 6 to 10 foot zone, around some type of isolated cover. Again, depending upon where you fish, that sometimes finding that isolated piece, you're going to have to do a little bit of work and finding the stuff that may be a little bit more obscure, especially if you're talking, about some of the Tennessee River lakes that have, lots of wood, lots of docks, lots of the same type of cover. You need to find something that's a slight bit different. Maybe it's a scenario where if you looked on that map where that roadbed ran across, those 3 specific docks, that pattern within a pattern, something like that would be something that I would probably be keyed into.
Okay. Next question is a great question we got right at the beginning, and you're heading up to New England. This gentleman, Mike, is from New Hampshire, and he is specifically talking about Newfound Lake.
Okay.
He's got a tournament up there, but what he's asking about is something I think a lot of people face, and that is that he's got a tournament that happens to be on June 18th, but what are you looking for when you start having those situations where the water warms up fast and then it gets really cold? Like he's wondering about how it changes the post-spawn scenario. Does it or doesn't it? And, kind of run with kind of that northern view.
Yeah. Good question, and I've seen it happen a bunch of times, and I'm sure looking at the weather too. It warmed up pretty quick last week in New Hampshire probably for the first time this year, and I know if you look at New Hampshire versus Maine, the reason why I bring up Maine is because I'm going to be there next week, and the weather that they've had versus the weather that New Hampshire's had, even though they're states that are next to each other, are quite a bit different. Maine 3 weeks ago had ice. New Hampshire probably didn't. Massachusetts probably didn't. In fact, I know Massachusetts didn't have ice 3 weeks ago. So they've had ice out a little bit, longer than Maine has. So they're, even though they're fairly close, they're still a little bit behind. Now, June 18th, and I don't know when the moon phase is in June, but if there's a full moon fairly close to there, I could probably bet that the fishing is going to be pretty darn good. They'll probably be, the first wave of fish will be done. There'll probably be a big second wave. It'll be that scenario that I talked about the initial wave, there being a smaller group of fish, and then the bigger one will be in June, and then maybe even in some stragglers into July. So I'd be looking for several different things, and it's kind of almost like a wide open situation when you get into that point, because you could be virtually catching some pre-spawn fish and post-spawn fish in the same areas, and then you could be catching some spawning fish as well. So I don't know if I have any one bit of information, only to keep an open mind and do a lot of looking, and if you've got some time to go pre-practice, and watch your water temperatures too. Even though it creeped up and got real warm here, and then it got cold, that'll kind of spur those fish, almost like what the guy from Oregon was talking about. It got real warm and the fish moved up, and they kind of were cruising all around. Just because it got to that 68-degree mark doesn't mean they all moved up and spawned in one day. It just doesn't happen that quick. It takes a little bit of time.
Okay.
So, what was that?
I said, okay.
Yeah. So,
got a couple more questions for you. Basically, I got a gentleman here from Indiana is asking about, and this is going to be that central part of the United States. I live in Minnesota, but it's going to be all of that area. He's
sure.
asking, what months are you considering pre-spawn, spawn, and post-spawn when you think of Indiana? And, you can include Illinois and Missouri, all that kind of stuff.
And I guess if he's in central Indiana, like, fishing Geist Reservoir and all those places around there, I would say, and of course it's weather driven too. And I've spent a bunch of time in Indiana traveling around this past spring, and they haven't had a horrible winter. So I would probably assume that they were about a month behind what we were here in Tennessee. So March was probably the first wave, April was probably the second wave. This past month here, May, was probably the last of the fish that were going to go. So I would probably be looking for, of course, they have shad in a bunch of the lakes, so that shad spawn could be full swing right now. It could be really perfect, because ours we just hit about the tail end of it the last week. It got over with. They're a little bit, 6 or 7, 8 hours north of us, so that shad spawn could really be going full spawn, full gear. And then the bluegill spawn, obviously, there in Indiana is great, so that'll happen just after. So I'd be looking for, the rest of this month, whatever's left of it, and all through June, to be awesome fishing to try to exploit both of those patterns, the shad spawn and the bluegill spawn.
Okay. And then last question of the night, we'll get you out of here. And that is a couple questions regarding how are you keying in on that bluegill spawn? And I can tell you from a Minnesota guy that fishes a lot of Minnesota, Wisconsin stuff, you can see them sometimes, but sometimes you can't. What are you looking for those keys to understand when and kind of, how? You mentioned those sandy points, but can you expand upon that?
Yeah, and that's obviously the bluegills are going to spawn around some kind of a sandy, flat, whether it's a point or the back of a little pocket or a little depression, that sort of thing. So initially, looking on my map, I'm gonna select areas that kind of meet that criteria. And then you just don't know sometimes until you go there and look. And then once I go there and look and start fishing, I'll typically fish through an area first, and if I get a bite or two, and then I'll go in for a closer look and kind of see what they're on. And a lot of times you'll see, because the bluegill beds will be in big clusters. And if the water is clear enough, you can actually see them from a pretty good distance. If you've got a little bit of, murkiness, you might not see them till you get right on top of them. So I want to kind of stay away a little bit and fish through an area first. And that's kind of how I found these fish the other day, is that I wasn't even, thinking about it at that time. I just happened to catch a few fish off a little sandy rounded point. And I said, well, that's pretty odd that, I know these fish are probably done spawning, but, why are they here? And the next one I got to, I caught a couple more fish, and then I got a closer look and noticed that there were some bluegill beds. So it's pretty easy type of pattern to recognize, because a lot of times you'll just see the bluegill beds down there. They'll be in big clusters. It won't just be one of them.
Okay. Well, hey, Mike, thank you very much for your time tonight. We really appreciate it. Folks, again, we've mentioned it a couple times. You can go to navionics.com, see all of Mike Delvisco's webinars he's done with us. In addition to all of the other webinars we've got just a huge list of different categories and different, even different species and different, so we've got saltwater, we've got freshwater, we've kind of got it all. So take a look at navionics.com. You'll find our webinar listing towards the bottom of our main page. And then you also can find out our upcoming webinars. But Mike, thank you very much for your time. I'll definitely make sure we get you on the list for some kind of winter discussion, get your whole season rounded out, and a guy can not have to chase you around in the water. He can actually know how to catch fish just like you year-round. So thank you for your time tonight.
Thanks very much. And thanks, guys. Have a great spring and summer fishing, and we'll see you in the wintertime.
Thanks now, Mike.